Let's bust some more Victorian dress myths. Good day and welcome. My name is Caitlin, and here on this channel I teach old-fashioned sewing skills primarily for the 19th and 20th centuries. If you're a regular on this channel, thank you so much for coming back. If you're new here, hi, welcome. I'm so happy you're here. If you're into anything like historic wardrobes, historical dressmaking, sewing, any of that sort, consider subscribing to follow along. While I no longer work in museums, I do volunteer at one quite frequently because my husband is a curator, and I do keep a small collection of original garments to study from and to teach others historical sewing techniques. So no, I'm not a professional historian. I did not go to school for this. I'm really good at finding original sources and documenting stuff, and I enjoy doing it, and it's like a puzzle to me. So today we're going to look at some more Victorian dress myths. I've absolutely loved putting these videos together, and it seems like y'all are really enjoying them, so we're going to continue this. I'm going to try to keep them under an hour. The last one was long, and really it really should have just been one myth because the other two did not get much screen time. But I think we thoroughly looked at the whole dresses were worn for 20 years theory. If you've not watched the first Victorian dress myth busting videos, I will link them above. But again, as a rule, we don't do things like, oh, my grandmother told me that this was how it was back, when her grandmother was alive, or I always read that, or everyone knows that. We deal in cold, hard, documentable facts here. So now that we've got the disclaimer out of the way, let's look at some myths. For today, I picked up 3 more myths to look at, and these are things I've heard over and over again from living historians to museum professionals in some cases to just the general public. Things that just didn't sit right with me and that no one could ever provide documentation for, so I looked into it myself. And I figured if I'm hearing them all over the place, then other people probably are too. And just so y'all know where we're going with this video, the first myth we're going to look at is the myth that they didn't have bright colors back then. The second myth is going to be the myth of women dressing as men, especially on the farm or out west. And the third myth is going to be that their fabrics were better back then. So the first myth I want to look into is the myth that they did not have bright colors back then. And this one's going to have to be one where you're going to have to look at your screen because I'm going to share all the pretty pictures. And I hear this myth all the time, especially when I wear my 1830s indigo dress that I dyed myself with natural dye using a period recipe. And I have other living historians coming up to me saying things like, oh, that color's not correct. You couldn't get that shade of blue back then. And I just lock eyes with them and go, this is naturally dyed indigo that I did myself using a period receipt. It is 100% correct. And just watch them try to stammer their way out of that one. I am not a professional dyer. I'm more of a throw some things in a hot pot and just see what happens form of a color happy chaos goblin. I teach dyeing classes, y'all. I teach all sorts of old-fashioned skills and classes from both my house and also various historic sites around the state of Texas. And I usually start off, especially my dyeing classes, a lot of my classes, I start off with, who's ever tried this skill before? If you've ever taken a class on this, I'm going to not be like any instructor you've ever had. I don't measure things. I don't have method. I'm more of a screw around and find out type of person. Welcome to Chaos Learning with Caitlin. And if you are in the Central Texas area and want to learn some weird skills, I will list the Pioneer Farms website and down below. If you're in the area and would like to take some skills and some classes, those are available. Anyway, that was a little bit of a shameless plug. Let's go back to the myth. For some reason, we have this idea that you cannot get vivid and saturated colors and shades with natural dyes. And I think this kind of comes about with the creation of the synthetic or the aniline dye starting in the 1850s. These dyes did make certain colors and shades much cheaper and easier to produce, and therefore they just became more accessible to the average person. It's not that you couldn't get bright colors back then. It's more of they just became more easily available with the creation of aniline dyes. So because most synthetic dyes are going to be produced in the very late 1850s up into the later 1860s, we're going to look at originals that are pre that time period, so like late 1850s and earlier, to make sure that we're not getting any of the synthetic colored garments in our research. It's not that aniline just took over and there were all of a sudden, post 1865, no naturally dyed garments, or post 1870 there were no natural dyed garments, but you can't tell for sure unless you get your hands on the garment and sometimes do chemical tests on it, and we don't have that luxury, so we're just going to we're just going to try to do it pre-1855 just to make sure that we're not having anything that is aniline dyed. So first we're going to a little bit more of the dyeing process. So to dye fiber, you need three things. You need the fiber you're going to dye, the dye stuff, and you need a mordant, which is something that makes the dye stick to the fabric. It's what keeps the fabric from being like a stain that can wash out. It actually adheres the dye to the fabric. And mordants are important because in some cases they can change the color that you get with the dye stuff based on the fiber. Do you know what else changes the color of a finished product? Well, aside from the temperature of the dye pot, the amount of dye used, how many times that dye pot has been used before, the main thing that actually determines the color that the fiber produces is actually the fiber itself. So protein fibers like silk and wool are going to take on generally a much more vivid and bright and more saturated color than a cellulose fiber. If you're not familiar with those terms, it's okay, I'm going to explain it. So a protein fiber comes from an animal. So like human hair is a protein fiber. So protein fibers come from animals. This would be things like sheep's wool or alpaca. And it also includes things like silk, goats, dog fur, rabbits. Basically, if it's an animal-based fiber, it's likely going to be a protein fiber. Cellulose fibers, or plant-based fibers, are the ones that come from plants. Think cotton and linen, and there are other lesser-known ones, such as piña cloth, which is cloth made from pineapple leaves. Although that is very hard to get today, except for in the Philippines. It was a little bit more common in the 19th century. And today we also have fibers that are made with things like banana leaves or even rayon, which is technically still a natural fiber, even though it is messed with by man, I suppose. So basically all natural fibers come from living things. Cellulose fibers come from things that photosynthesize, and protein fibers come from things that are higher up on that food chain. And the fact that cotton and linen and other plant-based fibers that did not take color as well as, say, silks and wools, was a well-known problem in the 18th and 19th centuries. In Volume 6 of the Repository of Arts, Manufactures, and Agriculture, which was published in 1810, it says, quote, "Linen and cotton, as vegetable substances, have the defect of not taking colors with solidarity. This cause resides in their resinous principle, which we must endeavor to remove from them." End quote. It talks about helping cotton take on a more vibrant hue by using alcohol, which is cost prohibitive, and also fish oil, which is time consuming. There's also a theory by a man named Thomas Cooper who wrote an American dye book in 1815, I believe, and he had theories, and apparently it works. If you soak the fiber in animal blood or in animal dung, you can infuse proteins or animal proteins into the fiber and watch it take dye better. We're not going to talk about that today. That'll be a whole nother video. So going back to what affects the shade or the color that you get, yes, protein fibers will typically take on a more vibrant or at least a much deeper hue than the plant-based fibers. And why is this important? Well, as living historians who are trying to document our fabrics that we're choosing to make our reproductions, this is actually where I see a lot of people making mistakes. Is they will decide they want a color, or they will find a fabric that they love and they know the print is correct, or the design, whatever, is correct, but they're not sure about the color. So they'll go to, say, Pinterest or museums, and they'll just try to document that color. And typically they'll come across a silk gown in that color, and they don't realize that that particular shade may not be possible, or at least be extremely hard to get in their cotton print as it would be a silk. It's not enough to go through Pinterest and just say, oh, I see a teal 1850s gown, so I can use this teal cotton print. Well, that teal 1850s gown that you see on Pinterest is actually 1860s based on the fact it has that little standing collar, those lovely, very big pleats, and those coat sleeves very much say post-1863 to me. But I could see that gown starting as an early 1850s gown based on those very long pleats and that very long waistband. So it's possible it was 1850, just remade over to an 1860 style. But still, that teal gown is silk. You cannot compare silk to cotton when you're talking about colors that are being dyed. Those are very different fibers, and they're going to dye very differently. That shade may not be possible in the 1850s with cotton. It may be, you just have to document it. And this is where it becomes even more difficult to do so, because so many original garments that are actually wool are labeled in museums as cotton. And that's a really tough one, because people trust museums. And when they mislabel things, people can get heated, and they don't like you telling them that their research is not correct because, well, the museum says it, and the museum obviously knows what it's talking about because it's an institution of learning. It is supposed to be correct. And yes, museums should be a place where real history is presented without undocumented conjecture, but you would be surprised how many museums, especially the smaller ones, are taking family lore in the pieces and passing that down as documentation. Also, when you get even bigger museums with huge collections, it's very difficult for one person, the curator, or even a team of curators to know absolutely everything about fashion within every time period that that museum happens to collect. Things change, and there's so much nuances even between seasons and exact years, especially within the 19th and 20th centuries, and even to some extent earlier. Things change very rapidly, and it's very difficult to understand those nuances unless you've studied for lifetimes, which most people don't have the opportunity to. So yes, there are countless things in museums that are mislabeled. So going back to when I used to work at museums, we had a pair of boots that was very clearly late 19th century based on the fact it had pointed toes, it had a nice heel. They were very long lace-up boots, very clearly later 19th century. They were labeled as 1850 because they were found in Mrs. Cobb's wedding trunk that she got when she was married in 1850. So obviously everything that was in that trunk had to date to 1850, right? I never actually did get them to change the full description on those boots. I did get the curator to put in a note saying, here's some reasons that this may actually date later, but we didn't actually get to actually change it because someone at the museum was very attached to the idea that they were 1850s. I have also seen a very late 1870s to early 1880s toddler dress labeled as a plantation slave-made christening gown. So yeah. And it's not the museum's fault at all. Like I said before, it is impossible for one person or even 5 people to know all the ins and outs about absolutely everything within their time or their county, if they're doing a county museum, or their exact time period, or even whatever time frame that their museum collects. Even if they have a very niche collection, it can take lifetimes to learn all the ins and outs. And so you always have to look at everything that's not specifically documented in a dated source with a little bit of skepticism. And yes, there's a cat with me. He just had his lunch, and he's going to let me know that he did not get enough to eat, even though he is fed 3 times a day. All that to say, you can't always trust museum collections. They do their best, especially the smaller ones, and they often have the coolest things. So smaller museums, they own some of the coolest things, but they're also the most likely to mislabel and misstate things based on family lore. The people who donated the artifacts, whose families, especially over generations, the older the garment is, like to exaggerate things, or sometimes things just get misremembered. I mean, can we really trust the 95-year-old grandmother who in 1880 is treating her dementia with copious amounts of alcohol to remember exactly what her grandmother told her when she was 4 about the family's antique spinning wheel? Are we sure she's going to get that information right? Or like, let's say a lady bought a green parasol in 1845, and then because green was her favorite color, bought another green parasol in 1860. And then 80 years later, her granddaughter finds a parasol in the attic, happens to be the 1860s one, and wants to play dress up, and her grandmother tells her, oh yeah, I bought that in 1845, because she remembered that she bought a green parasol in 1845. And that 5-year-old's going to grow up misunderstanding, or at least not having the correct date on that parasol, and people can get very attached to the information that their loved ones give them. Even if we provide proof that what their loved one says is not correct, they can get very attached and very upset if you suggest to them that this may not be correct because of this, this, and this. So anyway, I got off on a tangent, but yes, you can't always trust family lore, and museums who typically use family lore because they don't have any other way of dating things can be a problem when you're trying, as a living historian, to do things as right as possible. So anyway, we were talking about museums labeling wool dresses as cotton and this being a problem. Well, again, wool and cotton are 2 different types of fibers. One's a protein fiber, one is a plant-based fiber. And so the same shades and colors may not be possible in both. So you cannot compare apples to oranges and say, oh, this color is period accurate, because that labeled cotton dress might be wool. So let's go ahead and get into the meat of this myth. I want to do this by color, and we'll just look at the colors of the rainbow instead, because I think we should. And obviously everyone knows that they all wore black and brown back then, so I don't think we need to document those colors. On the screen, I'm going to show 18th and early and mid 19th century clothing in that color. And although I wanted to add dye information into this video, I know for time purposes that's not going to be possible. So instead, that's going to be a separate video coming out next week. So let's start with red. I have a pre-1865 wool shawl that cannot be aniline dyed because red was one of the very last aniline dyes that came out. And I want you to look at this very bright hue. Isn't that gorgeous? And look at all the secondary colors. Like, look at the light teal and the white and the black, etc. Again, this wool is a protein fiber, so it's going to give on that very nice vibrant hue. And here's an 1828 red silk gauze dress. And that one is 100% naturally dyed. There's no questions about that. 1828 has to be natural. Another silk gown, this one is 1837. And here's a 19-teens silk net gown. And it's kind of hard to get a true read on this color, so I chose a back view where, all those pleats together kind of give you a better color for the back. Or a 1775 silk panel. Oh yes, did bright red ever exist. But notice how all those very bright, beautiful colors were all silks and wools, so protein-based fibers. But what about cotton and linen? What does naturally dyed cellulose fibers look like? Well, here's an 1830s red cotton print dress. It's not nearly as vivid. It's still a pretty color, but it's not quite like those silks and wools. Here's a dress that the Met has labeled as 1830, but it looks very 1815 to me. It's red and pink with cream. And here's another 1830s red dress that could be wool, could be cotton. I'm not entirely sure. And here is an 1820s red roller printed cotton dress. Or how about this Dutch red and white plaid apron from the early 19th century? And here's another 1830s red cotton dress. It's another fairly bright early 19th century red print. And here's a red cotton cape from the early 19th century. Can you see the shade difference though? And that's not to say the cotton ones aren't pretty. There are some very nice, pretty cottons. They just don't pop up as frequently as they would if it was a wool or wool blend. And I do wonder if some of those very, very bright ones actually had animal-based proteins infused into the cottons to give them that bright shade. And since pink is a lighter version of red, we're going to go ahead and add that here. Pink is something you actually see a lot of in cottons in the early and mid-19th century, especially for kids wear. So here's a little boy's outfit from 1825, and a pink print bodice from 1830, and another pink 1825 pink dress. This time it's a woman's dress. Here's a pink pocket from the very early 19th century, and a pink toddler's dress from 1815. And yes, you do see pink in silks and wools. Here's a pink 1840s evening dress. So my most favorite pink dye is cochineal. It's what I use a lot, and it's a very tiny little bug that lives in a cactus, and we'll talk again more about that in the actual video about dyeing, but just kind of show you the difference between wools and cottons and how they take dyes. So I taught a dye class, and on the same day, at the same time, in the same dye pot, with the same mordant, and letting it seep for the same amount of time, here's some wool yarn and then a cotton bandana. So the wool, both of them were mordanted with alum, again stuck in a pot together with cochineal. And yeah, we got a very bright fuchsia color for the wool and a orangey coral for the cotton. You can get flag red and cochineal as well, but with different mordants and different processes. And again, I'm not going to dive into that today for time's sake. If you hear background noise, I apologize. A huge storm just went down, and so it is pouring down rain. It's not thundering and lightning yet. Hopefully I didn't jinx that, but if you hear something in the background, that's going to be that. So let's move on to orange. Here's an orange 1865-ish silk corset, which could be aniline dyed, could be natural dyed, and an 1830s-ish silk orange plaid that's in wool. And then another silk, this one is 1836. And here's an orange wool shawl from the early 19th century. Orange did not seem very popular in the 19th century, pre-1865, or at least when the aniline dye came out for orange, where it kind of bloomed. So I had a really hard time finding orange cottons. And there wasn't even a lot of orange silks and wools other than what I already showed you, except for it did seem, at least in wools and silks, to be a common 18th century color. But I wasn't able to find any cotton examples because I don't actually study that particular time period, and I don't have 14 plus years of photos to look through like I do for the 19th century. So anyway, I found this 1855 print swatch book, which is mostly cotton, and that could be brown. They do look more orange to me close up, and then this one looks more orange as well. And here's an orange-ish 1840s wrapper. So dull orange is really brown, right? So these very well could be orange. They just appear more brown because they're in cotton or because they're around 200 years old and colors fade. And before we go on to yellow, here is a 19th century pocket with lots of pretty colors, but I think there is an orange right there. And then here's from my dye class. This is achieved by a student on wool, and it was alum mortated, and she used madder root for the dye. Now yellow. You can see some very vivid, hurt your eyes yellow in silk. Seriously, some of them look almost neon to me. Here's a silk dress that's labeled 1861. I'm going to tell you that's at least 1863 based on the coat sleeves. That could be aniline. But even going back further, here's an 1830s silk yellow dress that is definitely not aniline. And yellows seem to be very popular in and around 1780 to, and it's just like 5 years before and after. So here's a 1775 dress in silk. Here's a 1780s dress, and this is a 1780s banyan and a 1785 silk fabric. I also found Regency silks that were in yellow, so like this 1810 dress and this 1815 dress. So what about cotton? So here's that 1855 swatch book again. Here's some purples, a sea green, and a yellow over at the bottom. Here's a yellow circa 1840 dress, and then another circa 1840s yellow cotton dress as well. And this is a very pretty yellow, in my opinion, 1825 printed dress. And now green. Green's a fun one because I find the easiest way to get green with natural dyes is to actually over dye blue with yellow. And that's been the best way for me to get green. And that's what my student did here to get this very dark green. I have not tried that on cotton though. I assume it would still work. But here's a wool chalice 1840s green dress and another wool 1840s dress. I found two green 1840s wool wrappers or 1850s green wool wrappers. And for green silks, here's a 1740s green coat, a green silk gown from 1775, a green 1780 dress, and here's a green silk velvet 1820s dress. And this is one of my absolute favorite dresses from the late 1830s, which is my favorite time period, and it's 1838, and it is in green. For cotton, here's an 1830s green print. I have found two 1830s green and purple prints. And here's an 1850s child dress and some 1855 swatches in green. Now blue, which is my favorite color. Blue was historically also a favorite color based on how many blue dresses there are. And I don't think it ever truly went out of fashion. So let's start with the silks. This is 1725. Here's another 1725. This is a 1750s court dress, an 1840s dress, several 1850s blue silk dresses, including this child's dress, which is probably my favorite shade of blue. And then this is my favorite piece in the entirety of the 19th century. It's an 1858 fancy dress costume showing day and night. And one day I will find myself an 1850s fancy dress ball to attend, and I will make this dress exactly. It has matching shoes and a matching fan, by the way. And one day I will make it. We're planning an 1880s fancy dress ball next year for a poncho, but one day I'm going to figure out how to get myself into an 1850s one because I really want this dress. So now for blue wools. Here's an 1840s wool print dress, another blue print dress that's blue, and another 1850s blue print dress. So now for cotton, starting with this 1850s cotton dress, and then the 1855 swatch book has several pages of blue. Here's just a few of them. And here's another 1850s blue dress. And going back to the dye class, you can see the blue that we dyed with indigo on the same vat, same day. And here's some of the cottons that we also dyed. Again, same vat, same day. And you can see that the darker shades were the ones that were left in the vat longer. And finally, purple. So starting with silk. This is an 18th century costume that I believe is from Japan, if I remember correctly, and an 1830s purple silk dress. As for cotton, there's lots of 1830s cotton dresses that were purple. This one is a linen dress in pink and purple. Here's a checked 1840s dress. And then the 1855 swatch book has a couple pages of purple as well. Purple is a color I've not personally tried for, so I have no fun pictures to show you personally. And I don't know why, because I like purple. I don't know why I've never attempted purple. But that's about it for that myth. So moral of the story is to make sure you match the color of what you're trying to recreate with the actual fiber. Don't believe anyone who told you that they don't have bright colors back then. They lie. So our second myth is going to be that you can't do much dressed in all of that. And so a lot of hardened women, like on the frontier, just dress like men to get anything done. And you see this over and over in Hollywood, right? So I'm not going to deny that there were women who dressed like men. They are extremely rare, but yes, they existed. There was of course the whole bloomer outfit that swept the nation in the mid-19th century of women wearing pants underneath their skirts and then wearing shorter skirts. And a personal connection to me would be Elizabeth Ney, who, because I used to docent at her house, she bought Leando from the Gross family in the 1870s. And if you've been on the channel since the beginning, you know that I used to portray members of the Gross family several years ago when I did more upper class stuff in Texas. And we used to go to Leando once a month. I would give tours there as long as Leando was open, which it was closed with the Great Plague and has not opened. We had a whole spiel on Elizabeth Ney. And you may not know who she is, but you likely know some of her works. Texas specifically, the statues of Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston that are on our state's capital, those are both her works. And then she replicated those, and those stand in the U.S. Statuary Hall on the nation's capital. So if you've ever watched a U.S. presidential inauguration, you've probably seen her work. Other work that she did, she was a very famous German sculptor. And yes, I said sculptor and not sculptress because she preferred that term. Long story short, found her way to Texas, Thomasville, Georgia, and then to Texas. And then in Germany, she was quite famous because she was female and a sculptor, and that was unusual. So, and when I tell you this woman was 200 years ahead of her time, she was one of the most feministic people I've met even today. I mean, she only went to an art school because, well, she wanted to, and her parents said no. So she went on a hunger strike. They called the priest. The priest came in and said, yeah, she really will starve herself over this. I'd suggest letting her go. So she got to go. She was the first woman at this art school and had to be escorted to her classes from what I've read. She ended up graduating top of her class and did end up going to have a successful career sculpting basically anyone who was anybody in Europe. Jacob Grimm of the Grimm's Brother fairy tales, Ludwig the Mad King of Bavaria, etc. When she got to Texas, a Texas governor figured out who she was, commissioned a bust, and then Elizabeth ended up building herself a studio in Austin, which is called Formosa. It is still a museum. It's open to the public. If you're in Austin, I suggest going. A very masculine woman for the time. She refused to get married for the longest time, stating because she had declared that marriage was a form of slavery, and to quote her, she said, "I will be a slave to no man." She did marry in secret, and even up to a few years ago, when a marriage certificate was finally uncovered, there is actually still historians who believe that she never really actually got married again until that marriage certificate popped up. And yep, she was. They were married. They never claimed to be. She would never say she was married. They just lived together and freaked out all the Bible Belt Southerners in the 1870s. They also had, from what I understand, an open marriage, so that was something else that kind of made her unlikable according to 19th century standards. Elizabeth kept her red hair cropped short, saying that it was very easy to keep clean in the marble dust because, again, she sculpted in marble. She wore pants most of the time, saying that she was getting up and down on scaffolding to get these huge, sculpts done. And so, yeah, she was an interesting lady. So, yeah, there were absolutely women who dressed like men and wore men's fashion. They were extremely rare, and like Elizabeth, they weren't often welcomed in society. They were seen as very strange. You don't get treated like a normal person if you don't conform to normal society standards, especially in the 19th century. And society had very strict standards back then. You were either ostracized or gawked at. And if you're willing to put up with that, then go for it. But most people weren't and just wore dresses. And you can do anything that in the 19th century that you want to in all those layers. And as someone who wears long skirts and petticoats every single day, and used to wear corsets every single day of my life, I can confidently say I have not found a single thing that I would do that I can't do dressed up in a corset and petticoats. I can climb trees, ride horses, feed farm animals, play with children, run around, cook on a hearth or stove, scrub floors. I don't even know what else. I can do all sorts of things. But just remember, 99% of Western women were dressing like this every single day from infancy, and they managed to do it all, no matter how they were dressed. And the trope of the manly girl that you often see in Hollywood is really because of two reasons. So one, they either pick out the vanishingly rare few historical examples because Hollywood likes a good story and the manly girl trope is different and more relatable. And which really irks me because, I don't know, I just feel like it's degrading to women. Saying that we can't do anything or aren't worth anything unless we dress and look like men, that's not girl power, that's misogyny masquerading as feminism. And if you have to change a woman's outward appearance to make her more interesting, you're saying that women aren't worth their salt and they need to change to be like men just to be able to do anything in life, which I just think is very offensive. So what about the women who went through history who did the things in corsets and petticoats? What about the spies who snuck behind enemy lines with important documents? Or women who defended their homes and families at gunpoint? Or who put life-saving measures in place in hospitals? Or who ran whole countries? Or became doctors, lawyers, and postmistresses? Or who were world-renowned mathematicians and inventors who still dressed like the average 19th century woman in corsets and petticoats? Were their accomplishments just not cool because they didn't outwardly wear fabric between their legs? What an arbitrary measure of a human's worth. A woman's sphere is wherever she makes good, no matter how she dresses. And quite frankly, anything can be done efficiently and well wearing corsets and skirts as it can in trousers and pants. Can you tell I have an issue when Hollywood uses the woman dressed as a man trope? Yeah, I find it highly offensive to women in general. Women can wear pants, I don't have a problem with that, but it shouldn't be their whole identity, and nor should it be touted as such. When I did say Hollywood does this for two reasons. And aside from plucking from actual history among the thousands of other accomplished women wearing corsets and petticoats, the other reason is to make a character who is tomboyish or otherwise just doesn't conform to society norms in their actions, and they like to match her clothing to her character. Now, I've seen Hollywood take characters either from history or from fiction and who dress normally for their time, but make them dress as men to add to their characters, whatever that means. I don't think it adds to their character personally. I think it's, again, degrading because changing something as fundamental as the clothing a person chooses to wear just for modern viewers' aesthetic, but maybe that's just me. True Grit is the one that comes to mind, even though the book was actually written in the 1960s. But we were just watching that the other day, so it's the first thing that popped into my head. So it's a totally fictional story, but on the front cover of the book, Maddie Ross is wearing a skirt. But in the recent movie, well, recent being like 15 years ago almost, they made her wear pants, because I guess it's just not cool that a woman can be herself in the wild and still needs to do what she needs to do. Honestly, Hollywood doesn't even usually go after making films about real women who dress like men. They just pick fictional characters who dress like men or take historical characters who dress like women and change it to make them dress like men, which really gets under my skin, especially for 19th century women. When Hollywood takes a historic character and dresses her in men's clothing or very sexualized men's clothing often, it's not only degrading to the woman's character, but it's also making the assumption that the woman would wear pants if she had the choice. This was 19th century. This was not Puritan England. Women in the 19th century could wear pants if they wanted to. In most places, there were not laws against it, and all women had to do was put up with snide comments and being snubbed and somewhat ostracized from society, which, yes, is a lot. But women did it. Sometimes. So when historical women did amazing things and did not choose to wear pants, aren't we degrading her as her own individual being for changing something as personal to her as her clothing choices? A, because it makes her more relatable. B, to make her more edgy, or for whatever reason they come up with. I don't know, that's just my thoughts. I honestly wouldn't mind seeing a well-done, accurate film about someone like Elizabeth Ney. I think her life would be amazing on film. I just want them to include it all. The pants wearing, the sculptor versus sculptress, the slave to no man quote, the open marriage, the sculpting for all the cool people in Europe and the US, but also the bad stuff, like she was really snobby to the locals and they all hated her. And also Elizabeth was a terrible mother, and the one son that didn't die of disease, and to be fair, she did love her kids. It seems like she loves her kids. I'm not saying that she didn't. But the one that was left hated her so much because how she traumatized him growing up that he refused to go see her on her deathbed. I just want it all. I want it with historically accurate clothing all the way around in the proper film locations. But please stop making choices for long dead people that they had the option to make for themselves and for whatever reason chose to not take that choice, just to make their story more interesting. And it wouldn't hurt to have some stories about awesome women who did awesome things in corsets and petticoats too, because they were far more numerous than the ones in pants. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Our third myth will be their fabrics were better back then, and I hear this one a lot, especially on my recent short about why 19th century dresses are better than modern dresses. I had a lot of people add in the comments that their fabrics were just better back then, and I do sort of agree, but also not, and it's such a nuanced point that it's very hard to research and to get the point across, because you can't actually feel what I feel when I feel original garments. A lot of you just don't have the opportunity, and I understand that. I'm going to try to get this point across. So this is not so much of a myth as it is, hey, let's really dive into this and really hash out what's going on with this very general statement of, oh, their clothes were better. So I think about how this clothes were better back then statement really got rooted back, is really kind of rooted into the grass is always greener type of mentality, and also a misplaced nostalgia in a way for times that are long since past, as opposed to, actual fact. So we're going to actually look into the actual facts of this and say, is the fabric better or not? So when I ask people to clarify what they mean when they say that fabric is better back then, 98% of the time they will say, well, the fabric was thicker back then. It wasn't the thin stuff we have today. So what I gather is that most people today consider thick fabric to be better quality. Well, if that's the case, then 19th century fabrics were not better by modern standards, because 19th century fabrics on average were much thinner and finer than what we have today. So in that case, if you believe that the fabrics were better because they were thicker, that is a myth. Fabrics can be better for other reasons, but not because they were thicker. And the reason people think that older fabrics were thicker, because most of these people today have lived in the 20th century, where fabrics were, as a general rule, thicker than they are today, but they were also much thicker than what was going on in the 19th century, which is what I typically talk about. So that's the myth that we're going to be busting today, is that the older fabrics were really thicker. So again, 20th century fabrics in a lot of cases were thicker than modern 21st century fabrics. I'm going to 100% grant you that. But we're not talking about the 20th century vast majority of the time. That short was talking specifically about 19th century dresses, and this is a Victorian dress myth-busting video. So we're going to look at the 19th century. And most 19th century silk taffetas I have handled have felt more like a modern tissue silk taffeta as opposed to a dress weight upholstery taffeta that we find today. Their silks were more opaque than our tissue taffeta, meaning they weren't quite as see-through, but their weight and the drape was much more of a tissue taffeta than we see with our upholstery taffetas today. And that's something I often see living historians do, is buy silk taffeta when really most of the originals, at least that I have handled, have been more of a tissue taffeta weight. And yes, that is really splitting hairs when it comes to finding period correct fabrics. I understand that. But honestly, it's what I find. It's not something that people generally talk about or know about. And it can be very hard, because finding tissue taffetas today and something that's not a solid color is very hard. So I get it. I have fabrics that are not tissue taffetas in my reproduction wardrobe, because I understand it's very hard to find those. From silks, let's move on to wools. Oh my gosh, when I say that 19th century wools have been done a disservice with the 20th century, because I don't know what happened in the 20th century where everyone decided that wool has to be scratchy, the most stupid, boring, awful, puke colors, and be super, super thick. I don't know where that came from, but somewhere in the 20th century that popped up, and that's been wools ever since. Yes, those wools existed in the 19th century. They're called uniform wool in my opinion, because in my opinion there are two different types of wool. There's dress wool, there's uniform wool. And those are not period terms, but in terms of reproductions that I work with, those are the two types of wool that I work with. But dress weight wools back then were so thin and fine. I've handled wools so fine that you could have sworn they were modern cotton calico if I hadn't seen the fibers under a microscope. I've handled wools that were so sheer that you could read a book through them. Those fabrics exist today, but they are very hard to come by. And I don't know who decided that modern wool should only come in stupid colors like black, gray, or brown. If anyone knows who to blame for that, I would like to know, because I kind of want to go slap them. And we've already learned that wool takes the most vibrant and bright and beautiful colors, so why are all of our choices so bad? I would 100% agree with people who say 19th century fabrics are better than modern when speaking about wool. There is nothing I like about a modern wool. Period wools, best fiber ever. But if you think that old fabrics were better because they were thicker, that's not the only thing we should be looking at. Thickness is not quality necessarily. Comfort should be a big factor as well as the feel of the fabric itself. And I do find that period fabrics often feel better to the touch than modern ones. Some of the fibers that age extremely well, like linen, So if I wasn't someone who did not wear pre-1920s garments, I would 100% be wearing my 1820s chemise like all the time. That is the nicest feeling fabric ever. But it's linen. Linen gets softer and more absorbent the more it's worn and washed. And so yes, whenever I start wearing the reproduction I made of it more and more and wash it more and more, it's going to eventually feel like that original. But yes, that old one feels so good. I've handled period fabrics that feel like cobwebs in my hands. And I've seen, again, wool so sheer you can read a book through them. And those fabrics are so much finer than anything you can get today. You can get some that are pretty darn close, but not quite there. But I would still consider them very high quality goods, even though they're very fine and thin. And that's not to say that there weren't cheap fabrics back then. There absolutely were cheap fabrics. Take about any housekeeping book in the 19th century, and it will talk about avoiding inferior goods, stating that a good calico dress may last a year, and an inferior one 6 months, and you've lost time and money in making it up. So the Common Sense Clothing by Edith A. Barnett, which is published in 1882, states this perfectly. And she says, quote, "Never buy low-priced common calico for any purpose. No calico should be bought that is stiffened with starch or size, as this all washes out and leaves the calico flimsy. Rub a corner with your fingers, and if they are covered with a white powder, reject the piece. It is more economical to pay a good price for a good calico rather than pay less price for a much worse article. If calico costing 2 shillings be made for 1 shilling into a garment lasting a year, the total cost per annum is 3 shillings. If a calico costing 1 shilling made in the same way only lasts 6 months, the total cost per annum is 4 shillings instead of 3, and the wearer has lost time in choosing the second garment and has passed through 2 periods in rags in the place of 1, end quote. And even throughout history, they had things like cheap silk. Yeah, fabric came in all sorts of qualities, bad and good, just like today. And like today, the more expensive typically means the better quality fabric. Not always, but generally. And it was the same back then too. You could get cheap silk back then. It wasn't recommended to get cheap goods because they wouldn't last, but they existed and people bought them. So Mrs. Gross, who was housed at Fort Clark, Texas in 1860s, they were on the fort and the officers' quarters burned down. And she had 3 silk dresses that she lost. Of the 3, the most expensive was worth $75 and the least expensive was worth $35. One silk dress was nearly double the cost of the other. So quality matters. Nicole Rudolph has a great video on the fact that mid and late 19th centuries, people were starting to put metal into some of their silks that was causing it to split. It wasn't the most purest and most quality silk. There are also other moths other than the silk moth that creates cocoons that you can take a fiber from. Silk Culture in the United States by Lauren Blodgett in 1882 states this on the inferior silk. A great deal of inferior silk from India and other remote countries is now used, not so much here as in Europe. Here are specimens of it. The product is an inferior class of moths. I've examined many of these cocoons and their fibers under the microscope and find that the black cocoon yields flat, coarse, apparently hollow fiber, inferior in every respect to true silk. End quote. So yes, cheap and poor quality goods existed. But those aren't the gowns and fabrics that survived most often, so we don't always know what those looked like. They were worn to rags and disposed of, or just plain out fell apart. So don't assume that because you've never seen a poor quality 19th century gown that they didn't exist. They did exist, they just didn't always last for us to study. And although one objectively could argue that 19th century fabrics were overall better, and I'd likely agree with you, that's not to say that there were not some very bad things going on with the fiber and the fabric industry in the 19th century. It's not even getting to the fact that there were a few but still existing garments that were dyed with toxic things like arsenic. Yeah, it happened, and yes, they knew it was toxic. And we don't get to patronize them. We wear polyester that sheds microplastics and gets into our bloodstream, and we know it's bad and we still do it anyway. So we're no better. It's cheap, it's available, and all of us can afford the good quality stuff. And it was the same back then. So were 19th century fabrics better than modern? Well, it depends on how you look at it. I'd say yes, in a lot of ways they were. At least I appreciate that they were all natural fibers and that they had a greater quantity of natural fibers. In our efforts to make fabric more accessible to people, honestly, we've done a terrible job. A lot of synthetics are just as expensive as the real deal, although we are told they are not, and we pay absorbent prices for synthetics. And they are hot and heavy, and they don't breathe. They're bad for the environment, and the fact that they are not always cost effective is just a nail in the coffin. I would much rather see a revival of not only natural fibers, but then maybe we can get a revival of some of the natural fabrics that we don't get to see anymore, like piña cloth. And that about just wraps up today's video on Victorian dress myths. Have you ever heard any of these myths? Are there any other myths that get under your skin that you'd like to share? Please let me know in the comments. I think we kind of all have a pet peeve history myth that really gets on our skin. I'd like to know yours. Thank you so much for joining me today and indulging me into debunking some more Victorian dress myths. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. Click that little bell notification so you're notified anytime I upload a new video. And as always, have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next video.